Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's EU DisinfoLab's webinar called How Can Civil Society Defend Itself? The EDRN European Democracy Resilience Network pilot story. Let's wait for a few seconds for more people to have time to join us, maybe. Okay, I think we can start. So welcome again. My name is Inès Gentil. I'm a project manager at EU DisinfoLab based in Belgium. Before we begin, a few quick reminders. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available shortly on our YouTube channel, where you can also access our past webinars. For questions, as usual, we'll use Slido and not the Zoom Q&A. You'll just have to scan the QR code on the screen or go to slido.com and enter the code #disinfo. We'll come back to your questions or remarks during the Q&A at the end of the session. To get started, we'll warm up with a couple of quick polls using Slido that will appear on the screen. Yes, so if you can tell us where you are joining us from today on the slido.com directly. Okay, Brussels, Italy, Torino. Nice. Germany. Many people from Germany, Brussels, Helsinki as well. Welcome. London, Ukraine. Amazing. Netherlands. Thank you. That's always wonderful to see such a broad geographic spread, mostly European. Thank you. Okay, we'll go to the next question, which is, which sector do you represent today? NGOs, media, academia. Yeah, strong representation from civil society, research, media, which is fitting for today's topic. Great. Now we can move to the next section, which is a quick introduction of what EU DisinfoLab does. We are an independent organization based in Brussels, dedicated to gathering knowledge and expertise on disinformation. We also support community building efforts by connecting stakeholders across sectors working on countering disinformation. And we regularly organize these webinars to highlight the work of experts across the counter-disinformation field, share knowledge, and improve dialogue across disciplines. So today's session focuses on a question that sits at the heart of what we do, but that doesn't often get enough attention, which is what happens when civil society organizations themselves become the target. Organizations working to protect democratic space, whether human rights defenders, fact-checkers, election monitors, investigative journalists, media literacy trainers, are increasingly targeted by hybrid digital threats. These aren't just disinformation campaigns. They also include cyber attacks, phishing, impersonation, doxing, account takeovers, and coordinated harassment, often deployed in combination and often with the explicit goal of silencing or discrediting the very people working to defend our information environment. And yet, most of these organizations face these threats alone, under-resourced, and without the structured support they need to respond effectively. And that is exactly the problem that the European Democracy Resilience Network, so EDRN, is designed to address. EDRN is a blueprint initiative co-created by the CyberPeace Institute and EU DisinfoLab, alongside more than 30 civil society organizations working to protect democratic spaces. And it ran from August 2025 to January 2026. So the pilot combined the baseline survey that Inès and Tana will present in a minute with collaborative workshops to understand what CSOs are actually facing on the ground and where support is most urgently needed. In today's session, we'll get a behind-the-scenes look at how the pilot was run and what were its main findings, and what the EDRN blueprint proposes as a practical and community-owned model for collective resilience. So we are very pleased to welcome two great colleagues from the CyberPeace Institute today. Inês Narciso, who is the head of information integrity and resilience at the CyberPeace Institute. She's an OSINT expert specializing in information manipulation, a founding member of FIMI ISAC, and the author of OPSINT guidelines. She also volunteers as vice president of OPSINT.eu, dedicated to promoting ethical and methodological sound practice in digital investigations, and is also a PhD researcher in communication sociology at IUL. Sorry for the bad pronunciation. And we have also Tanner Wagner, who is a cyber threat analyst at the CyberPeace Institute, with a background in Slavic studies, geopolitics, and cyber strategy. So Inês, Tanner, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll now hand over to you, and you should be able to share your screen. See you in 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. So let me just share my screen. Let's see. Please let me know when you see it. Are we
Yes.
good to go?
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So just a little bit by myself, as Inès has said. So my name is Tanner Wagner Forme. I'm based in Paris, France. However, I've been working for the CyberPeace Institute as a cyber threat analyst for the past 3 years. I've been working on various different projects at the Institute, such as, for example, our platform, Cyber Attacks in Times of Conflict, #Ukraine, but also projects such as our Nexus investigations of looking into the convergence of cyber attacks and FIMI and disinformation campaigns, but also cyber threat landscape reports such as our cyber resilience for financial inclusion in the APAC region report. But today I'll be talking to you about our EDRN initiative along with my colleague Inês Narciso. So just as Inès Gentil already explained earlier today, so our topic is how can civil society defend itself? And our response to that question is through essentially initiatives such as the European Democracy Resilience Network, or EDRN for short, that we'll be talking to you about today. So EDRN, as Inès said, is a blueprint initiative that was co-created between the CyberPeace Institute and the EU DisinfoLab, and it was built essentially a network or a cohort of more than 30 civil society organizations that are actively working in democracy resilience across Europe. So these are organizations that are really on the front lines when it comes to working to protect our democratic spaces. And so the pilot phase of EDRN ran from August 2025 to January 2026. And so during this pilot phase, we focused on co-developing of a community-informed dashboard concept to help CSOs to detect, to understand, and to mitigate hybrid threats. So not only malicious cyber operations, but also threats such as disinformation or FIMI, so foreign information manipulation and interference. And so the idea behind EDRN was essentially to build upon what we already do at the CyberPeace Institute, specifically through our CyberPeace Builders program. The CyberPeace Builders program is essentially a free cybersecurity service for civil society organizations that matches them with expert cybersecurity volunteers to help them with their cybersecurity issues. As these organizations are targeted by malicious cyber threat actors and generally lack the resources or the know-how to protect themselves digitally. In fact, you can actually learn more about the various cyber operations against CSOs on our CyberPeace Tracer platform, as shown by the QR code in the presentation. So yes, during this presentation, there will be quite uh, a few different QR codes for different platforms or reports. Um, and so, uh, with this overview, this includes monitoring hybrid threats, sharing response strategies, building capacity, development of a community-driven dashboard, and integration with the CPB. So essentially, how do we get to these strategies? Is through the fact that, yes, we have the CyberPeace Builders program, which mainly focuses on cyber operations, but not FIMI or information manipulation. So with EDRN, the essential aim was to address this gap by co-developing new tools and workflows specifically for information manipulation resilience. So before I continue, I'd like to point out a new QR code. This is a link to an optional survey for those who work for a CSO that has been targeted by an information integrity attack and would like to share. It is completely anonymous and it will be used as part of our data collection of these type of attacks against CSOs. The QR code will also be reshared later in the presentation, and a link will be shared by EUDL later as well. So going on to the presentation of why this work is important. So CSOs, like I was saying, working in democracy resilience are at the front lines of protecting our democracies here in Europe, whether they're reporting news, they're countering disinformation narratives, they're following elections, etc. And they are being targeted. This is what coming from them directly, is that they are being targeted. And so EDRN gathered more than 30 organizations from across Europe. And before our initial kickoff meeting, we were actually able to survey them, surveyed 29 of them who came back to us with some core evidence of these hybrid threats. So, for example, we have 79% of them have been targeted by disinformation, 52 of percent have experienced coordinated attacks. We also surveyed their operational security maturity as well. And we found that 45% of them lack monitoring tools. Incident tracking is mostly done manually as well by these organizations. 62% of them use multi-factor authentication. 45% lack audit awareness. Only 10% have a formal incident response plan. And with limited staff training, just 21% provide regular staff training to their employees. And so with this data, it led us to the identification of some key challenges. So these challenges can include persistent exposure to hybrid threats, inconsistent cybersecurity and monitoring practices, and gaps in preparedness and shared response mechanism. So following our initial analysis, we drafted our first prototype dashboard concept, which was presenting possible modules aimed at combating these key challenges that I just listed. The dashboard was shared with EDRN members all throughout the initiative to spark discussions and debate. I will share an updated version of this dashboard prototype later in the presentation and present the modules created with the input from our EDRN community. So next, I'll move on to the timeline of the initiative. So here is a more detailed timeline of the pilot phase of EDRN. So we began in last summer with the help of the EU DisinfoLab of identifying organizations operating in democratic resilience across Europe. We contacted them asking for their expression of interest. In September, we were able to send out surveys to these organizations and collect initial results, leading to our very first kickoff meeting in late September. We were able to have breakout discussions and present a mock-up dashboard as a starting point. And then in October, we began onboarding these organizations into the CyberPeace Builders program, along with the creation of the official EDRN webpage. And the EDRN was also particularly mentioned at the EU DisinfoLab conference as well. And then we began work with our first working group on social media monitoring and weak signals. November and December were dedicated to continuing working with these CSOs with our second, third, and fourth working groups. We'll go more into detail about these working groups, but the content of them was shared resources and access to support. We also had threat intelligence and trends, along with risk assessment, crisis communications, and policy uptake. Finally, at the beginning of this year in January, we were able to give a final presentation to the EDRN members to show them all the work that we've done throughout this initiative, all the input that we've gathered from them, how we've put that into place and modified some of the proposed modules in the dashboard concept as well, and which led to the publication of our blueprint report at the beginning of February this year. So now I'll pass over to my colleague Inês Narciso, who will take you in more details of our working groups.
Thank you, Tanner, for that amazing introduction. And I think now everyone has a good idea of why we developed EDRN and why it was also so relevant. But it became more and more evident as we had these working groups divided, the 4 working groups Tanner just mentioned. So first of all, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Inês Narciso, and I will basically cover a little bit of some of the conclusions that we had in these working groups. If you want to know more about them, they are in this final report that Tanner just mentioned. That is also available at the EDRN web page. That is edrn.cyberpeaceinstitute.org. So for the first working group, we were looking into social media monitoring and weak signals. And some of the conclusions that were already kind of adamant in the survey we launched was that it was clear that these threats are blending. And so that very clearly these attacks that CSOs have been experiencing come from multiple fronts. So they will have, for example, their emails spammed with junk emails. At the same time, there will be a sort of reputational attack going against them on social media, or they will get phone calls harassing their staff, for example, at the same time that there is impersonation accounts posing as them, for example, or websites posing as them. And one of the things that all of them felt were really relevant is this concept of starting to try to map these weak signals, because usually after they had been targeted, looking back, there were always like these small kind of hints, sudden sentiment shifts in the way that they were mentioned in social media, a multiple increase of visits to their website, all of these kinds of things, but that very often they would only find afterwards, after they would go doing the archaeology of these attacks. And by sharing the data on these weak signals, we could identify a lot of them that actually existed all through the EDRN incident pool, so to speak. And the same with the common attack patterns. So, one of the things that was mentioned the most was this targeting and harassment that would occur mostly on digital space, but sometimes, unfortunately, also on day-to-day lives. And also these narratives that would very often first actually appear on like Telegram or would circulate in closer groups, but then would then go into major platforms and be amplified. And some of the signs and these weak signals had actually an operational kind of disruption. So we would be talking about DDoS attacks that would take websites down, or an operational flooding, like a ton of emails requesting support, or requesting, for example, fact checking, or spamming just their mailbox to the point that it became really hard to separate what would be work content from what would be this kind of spammy content. And the top needs that were identified in this working group were, a better operationalization, I would say. Well, you understood it for sure, of these weak signals in a way that they could, in real time kind of identify that something was off and could activate multiple action plans to try to somehow mitigate it or be better prepared for it. So, these escalation guides, and also the very full awareness, and this will be mentioned at the end of this presentation on the main kind of next steps and lessons learned, that the issue was way bigger and way more coordinated than we initially thought, with organizations being targeted at the same time or things being targeted in the same way, but because they didn't mention about it, unless it's like in a coffee break at a conference that most of you here listening to us probably know, they would not know this was happening. So let's move into the second working group, which is the working group on shared resources and access to support. So once again, civil society is, struggling with resources, and this includes resources to basically defend itself more efficient. So besides the monitoring, that already is something that the organizations feel that is missing, these weak signals, getting alerts, knowing references, social media impersonation, social media mentions. They also felt that these alerts had to be paired with clear escalation paths, knowing exactly what they can do, what action points, who should they contact, and when they do, how can they log and preserve evidence in such a way that it will be usable, for example, in court. Of course, all of them reported problems with platform contacts and reaching platforms in terms of, for example, both massive reporting, like information suppression techniques of massive reporting that would lead to wrongful takedowns, but also impersonation accounts and other things that would, of course, disrupt their work, and they would struggle to reach out to platforms and solve these issues. So one of the things that we identified as a need of the community is these ready-to-use playbooks that, have a sort of routes, first steps, guidelines, or, okay, my account has been impersonated. What can I do? What can we do? What are the legal action? What are the pathways? What are the reporting mechanisms that we have? And of course, this legal support, even against SLAP lawsuits, which some of these organizations suffered from, and other kind of legal lawsuits, that any action that they would like to take, they would be starting from scratch instead of having, this kind of partnered, shared resource center with legal advice and also experts, legal experts that could help and provide support on these to these CSOs. And of course, these attacks also had, made some damage to staff. And we also felt it was really relevant to include well-being guidance and resources for vicarious trauma and other kinds of things connected to this kind of work, and sometimes the harassment and the violence that it may involve. Of course, the more that we make all of these things easy to adopt and to share, and these templates and these guidelines, and more importantly, and this is going to be said again, is the power that we have in all of these things that I just mentioned if we do it in a network as a group. So when we're talking about, platform reporting, if we are a big group, it's going to be completely different than if it's one isolated CSO. The same, for example, with any legal action, et cetera, et cetera. So moving on to the working group number 3, which was focused mostly on threat intelligence and trends. And here we're looking at, really taking the step back, as we've done with our CyberPeace Tracer platform that Tanner has presented, in which we look at the trends concerning cyber attacks against civil society organizations, and how we could, with this EDRN project, also bring the lessons learned from that into this idea that these more hybrid attacks that have information manipulation vectors to it can demonstrate certain trends that are happening, in a certain country, for example, against CSOs, or against CSOs from a specific group, for example, environmental activists, etc. So one of the trends we identified, as mentioned, is this convergence of the hybrid threats. Another one was that both impersonation and phishing were considered high priority risks, and that were very often reported as having happened. But the fact that there is no data sharing on these situations, and there is no central kind of repository for these incidents, which the EDRN pilot was one of the things we identified and we wanted to change. Very often these incidents remain kind of not connected to a trend. And with phishing, for example, this is interesting because Alex, head of EU DisinfoLab, actually presented at the last conference when we talked also about EDRN, for those who don't know, a phishing situation that happened to EDL that they later on understood was happening to a lot of CSOs. And this happened, because of informal conversation, personal data sharing. But we don't have a system in which we understand if these attacks are in fact part of a coordinated effort against civil society, or if they are an isolated incident. So that means that this threat intelligence has to be practical. And it needs to be something that, is intuitive, and that users can very easily kind of go into a dashboard, get an alert, and understand what is missing, because we don't want to increase the overload that CSOs already have. Everyone's kind of in the hamster wheel, so we don't want to be another kind of obstacle in your path. It's more about helping you anticipate threats. And of course, the baseline guideline is still missing, because a lot of these organizations do not have, the more expensive and very much more complex tools to protect themselves against a lot of these phishing, for example, risks, or account hijacking risks. And the other conclusion was that this, which is a general conclusion, that this trusted sharing can strengthen everyone. So just the fact that you get a phishing email, if you warn an entire network this has happened, it may happen that all of your other fellow sister CSOs also get it. And if they are warned, that they will not click on that link. And finally, we had a fourth working group that went to look into, the crisis, kind of more crisis comms aftermath look about these attacks, which is when they do happen, what can we as a group, as a network, prepare to, collectively become stronger? And some of the main conclusions was that, the readiness level was very not similar between organizations. Some had some level of preparedness, some plans in place. Some others had actually no kind of protocol or any plan of what they would do. For example, if they were targeted by a huge disinformation campaign or a ransomware or a hack and leak operation, for example. The biggest upcoming risks are these hybrid incidents. We have mapped this extensively in the Ukrainian case, that dashboard also that Tanner was mentioning, that the Ukraine project, where a lot of these cyber attacks also have an information manipulation vector. And then the other thing that most of them felt was, these small incidents would get kind of lost in day-to-day work. So you handle it with it immediately. You kind of look into, okay, we have this issue, but then you try to solve it really quick, and then you will not go back and forensically investigate it, report it, understand if it's part of a bigger kind of trend, if it's happening to others, if it's part of a bigger attack against yourself. So a lot of this is informal, and the risk management continues to be informal. A CSO that has a good contact in a certain platform maybe will be able to recover their account if it's hijacked, and if they don't, they won't. And it's all kind of based in these very much informal and every day-to-day kind of solutions, and not like a long-term project to handle with these. So one of the things we decided was a must was a sort of a first 24 hours checklist, which would basically have like a sort of to-do action points in case of different types of attacks, and also the develop of a hybrid attack kind of crisis plan, which could have tabletop simulations and kind of reporting guidance, and kind of help these CSOs when it does happen, how to develop a plan on what are the actions that they need to take. And having said that, I think now is a good moment for Tanner to basically show us the version of the dashboard we developed at the end of this pilot, of how this would kind of look visually in our considering the conclusions of these working groups. Tanner.
Yes, thank you very much. So for the dashboard prototype, this is something that we showed all throughout the pilot phase of the EDRN project. And so it's something that we've continued to modify as we've gotten input from the different organizations across the various during the different working groups. And so the way that we've thought to best organize all of this information was to divide it into three different categories. So starting off with your organization. So this would be an area essentially where you'd see specifics about your organization. And when it comes to, for example, your readiness or a roadmap of things that you need to do in order to improve your risk score and improve your cyber resilience score, and different actions that your organization can take. This can also include certain things of when it comes to events as well, so they have an idea of what is happening that could possibly affect your organization, along with a risk profile trigger section, and the first 24 hours checklist that Inês had just talked about from our fourth working group. We could also possibly include an identity watch. This is something in order to see whether or not there are any possible examples of a typo squatting of your domain of your organization. That could be considered an information integrity attack. Next, we have our EDRN trend. So this would be a more of a larger based data sample from all the organizations as part of the EDRN community. And so we'd be aggregating and anonymizing data from this group in order to display it for all the members so they have an idea of what is happening in the community at the moment. So it could be, for example, phishing campaigns tracker. So if you've recently been received a phishing attack, maybe it's for something regarded to elections of some sort. It would be interesting to see whether or not that's happening in other EDRN organizations. Or if they see that, they could also be prepared in case something of like that could happen to them as well. Um, Trends when it comes to possible impersonation cases. A very popular one was a narrative radar. So, for example, if we are coming across the cases of disinformation or information manipulation, whether or not we can track these different narratives so that we have an idea of what's happening when it comes to possible disinformation narratives affecting EU elections, for example, or elections in one specific country in Europe. A section dedicated to amplification channels, so identifying key actors, domains, handles that could be possibly driving harmful narratives. And events radar, similar to what I was saying earlier for your possible events, but just have an idea, for example, if there are EU elections coming up or if there are national elections coming up, just so that your organization has an idea of what are these big possible geopolitical events that could influence what is happening in cyberspace at that moment, along with incident stories. So this would be stories essentially of cyber or information integrity attacks, incidents that would be anonymized, but that would be shared amongst the community so they have an idea of what is happening in order to help better protect themselves, along with the TTPs of said attacks. Then finally, we have our third section, which is dedicated to resources. So this would be a section essentially where we'd have different training and guidances, different templates and things that researchers then could access to help themselves. A reporting hub when it comes to getting advice or guidance on how to report certain content to certain platforms or service providers or trusted flaggers, along with a researcher well-being, because we know at this point, as some of the CSOs throughout the EDRN pilot phase have said, that not only are the organizations have been targeted, but also sometimes the employees or the researchers themselves have also been targeted by either disinformation or possible phishing attacks or things of that sort, or other malicious cyber operations. So it's also very important for us to emphasize, and provide materials to help these researchers as well, along with a generalized resource sharing center and crisis communication kit, along with also when it comes to providing simulation exercises for the organizations to help them when it comes to training their employees in case of an attack of what to do. And so for the resources section of this prototype, this is something that we're actually currently working on to incorporate into our CyberPeace Builders platform. That were the CSOs, which is a group of 650 CSOs at the moment who belong to the CyberPeace Builders program. They have their access to their own platform page, and they see a lot of this info when it comes to the cyber side. But we're actually currently working at trying to integrate into that platform the information side. And so the resource side, the resource hub, essentially is one thing that we're currently working on at this moment. So heading back to the presentation. Now I'll let Inès talk us through our next steps.
So, what are the main kind of lessons that we learned from this pilot, and what are the moves going forward? So, what you saw was a very, very nice, amazing dashboard that Tanner just showed you. But of course, as you know, funding only goes so far. So we only got funding to kind of develop the dashboard concept in terms of architecture. So we're now looking into opportunities to develop this further from, the kind of implementation way. We do have some ideas, but of course, if you know of anything that you feel that aligns with this project, please get in touch. And why is this specifically, and why do we believe so extensively in this concept and on the relevance of preparing civil society against hybrid threats, and not only against cybersecurity? Because, first of all, these threats have been increasing. And we have seen, with the rise of AI, that this is just going to become cheaper and cheaper to do these attacks by threat actors. So we need to also invest on the defensive capabilities of these organizations to be able to basically continue to do their work. And this defense is a democratic necessity because it is, as we've seen, civil society has been the pillar of democracy and has been one of the main shields for civic participation in democracies throughout the world, even in places where democracy is not, stated in the government system. And there is another issue which for me personally, having been in the disinformation community for so long, and I know for DisinfoLab, and who has done this amazing work also in creating this network and this community of disinformation researchers, has been also an issue, which is we very much struggle still because of the scarcity of funding and because we are as much cooperating between each other as we are competitors for this very scarce funding, to create initiatives in which we cooperate effectively and create these work processes and professional trust between organizations to actually avoid duplication of work and start working together. And what we found, or one of the things that we found amazing at the EDRN, is that it is much easier to create collaboration and to create networks of CSOs working together in a defensive capability in which, people really want to, it encourages telling the stories, defending together, exchanging best practices, because there is no competition on the defensive side, than to build that on the other side, which is more in the reporting, investigation, looking for funding opportunities, etc. So if you are right now a stakeholder from any country or an institution, and you want to prepare, for example, your CSOs of your country for an election, this would be one of the best programs, because you will get everyone talking in a room, you will get everyone cooperating, everyone talking, and it's much easier getting stronger at defending yourselves together. And then, because people already know each other, trust has been built, you can start finding the duplication of work, and they can start, working on the offensive side of mitigating these threats to democracy together. But it's much easier to build this collaboration on the defensive side. Then, of course, there's also another thing that we feel really leverages this project, which is we can scale this very quickly because it complements a program that we already have, which Tanner has mentioned, that already has over 600 CSOs, and that you can also join. It is a free program to support civil society in terms of cybersecurity. And we are trying to add to this, to add an information integrity concept to it, because as we've talked extensively during this 40 minutes, clearly these hybrid threats are becoming more and more common, and we can no longer only defend for one side without defending for the other. And now I pass on to my colleague Tanner, who's going to give you some more information, including a survey that I would very, very much ask you to not only reply, share with other CSOs, because if you feel that everything we've just mentioned is important, do remember that we need the data to go to the stakeholders and say, this is happening, CSOs are being attacked. To have this data, we need your answers to the survey. Tanner, go ahead.
So before that, I'd like to share just this QR code and link to our EDRN Blueprint report. This is a report that recaps the whole entire pilot initiative. So everything that we've discussed today in writing also has some information about the prototype that I also shared. So please take a moment to read it if you'd like. I highly suggest it. Here is the QR code for the survey that Inês was just talking about. So please, if you're a CSO who has experience or has been targeted in the past when it comes to information integrity attacks, please take some time to fill out this survey. A link will also be shared by the EU DisinfoLab as well. And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Also, thank you very much to our wonderful friends at the EU DisinfoLab for having us and also for all of their collaboration and cooperation throughout this entire initiative.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you for this rich and very clear presentation and the demo of the dashboard as well. We can now open the floor for your questions or any remarks you might have. We have a bit less than 20 minutes for discussion. On the slides, you will see the QR code you can scan. A reminder to use Slido and not the Zoom Q&A. Once you scan the QR code, you can enter the code #disinfo. And beyond questions, yeah, if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or insights to share based on your own experience with these issues, we would genuinely love to hear them. This is more of a conversation, not just a Q&A. And the more perspectives we can bring, the richer it will be for everyone. So we can start the questions. We have one question so far. I'll take the opportunity to ask a first question myself before, so you have time to type yours. So to Tanner and Inès, EDRN sits at the intersection of cybersecurity and disinformation, as we know, two fields that are often perceived as having distinctive communities, methods, and cultures. In your opinion, what were the biggest challenges in integrating these two worlds, and what made it work, in your opinion?
If I can just start off briefly, I would say yes. As an analyst, in my case, in my experience, it feels like, for the longest time that these two domains have been siloed side by side, where you have cyber operations and you have information manipulation operations, where they seem to be traditionally two different things. However, research shows what we do in our our day-to-day work. It shows that they're actually very much interconnected and have been for a while. For example, in my work on the cyber attacks in times of conflict #Ukraine platform, we've noticed, for example, you could have a web page defacement against an organization in Ukraine or abroad, however, which is a cyber attack. But there's always an information manipulation aspect behind it, whether it's a cyber threat actor that is trying to promote some sort of narrative when it comes to the ongoing international armed conflict. Um, and so it's a challenge to convince people something that you already know it's happening when they have more of a traditional sense of cybersecurity is not the same thing as when it comes to FIMI or to disinformation. But I think Inês could probably maybe add more information as she's the expert on it.
No, I think you said it beautifully. It is at the core of the work that we've been doing at the CyberPeace Institute, um, both on a logic of defense. So in this case, the EDRN, which is kind of empowering civil society against a hybrid attack and understanding that, these threat actors, they're not siloed like us. They don't have the threat actor that's doing the cyber attack and the threat actor that's launching the disinformation campaign. They're using the same digital infrastructures, they're using the same staff, probably same building in many cases. And so we can no longer respond to these in the same siloed manner. The same with investigations. So if you are interested, we have another project called H-Armor, which specifically focuses more, it's also with several partners, but focuses more, again, on the offensive kind of look into these attacks as a part of a shared digital infrastructure that overlaps between the cyber and information manipulation world.
Great, thank you both. Let's start with the first question on the screen. Do you have any visibility into CSO attacks by the overload operation, so mainly targeting fact checkers?
Regarding overload, I would say that operation overload was discovered exactly to kind of like, I think, validate what we've been just saying. It was found out by a curious analyst that felt something was off and started talking with his fellow friends, fact checkers. And this has been done informally and was found informally because these human connections between the community exist. So of course the visibility that we have specifically is the visibility that most people have because there's extensive reporting on it. What we did was we used overload as a good example of how these dashboards would be relevant, how the sharing of incidents is relevant to identify these patterns. So specifically, I would say that it is a good example of something that could have been identified earlier on if a platform like EDRN is working and fully functional.
Thank you. Let's jump to the next question. Would you expect support for attacks only by the private sector, or should governments play a role too?
I'm understanding this question as in support when it comes to defending against these type of attacks. So I think both should play a role when it comes to helping build cyber resilience for civil society. So, for example, in the case of our CyberPeace Builders program, we actually have private sector cyber security experts who are volunteers who volunteer their time to actually help conduct cyber security measures and actions to protect these SEOs who are part of the program. But I also believe that, governments should play a role when it comes to offering resources, offering guidance on what to do in case of an attack. Would you like to add anything else to that?
No, that sounds great.
Thank you. Let's jump to the next question. Would you say there was any embarrassment from respondents due to lack of appropriate safety measures in place?
I don't know if we can really say if there was an embarrassment. The surveys that we conducted were anonymous, so we don't know who's using MFA or not. We did not ask them directly. I think basically we'd start off with the assumption that no one's using it, so that we're not putting pressure onto these organizations to make them feel embarrassed. We're just here to help them with their cybersecurity measures and to guide them. And so there's no judgment from our side when it comes to whether or not they're using certain things or not. The idea is that we have advice, and they are, it's up to them to take it or not.
Great. One thing that came through strongly in the working groups was the coordinated nature of the attacks. How are your organizations currently detecting that coordination, and at what point does it become visible to you?
I think that organizations have a feeling, or they have indicators of coordination in the sense that it is happening at multiple attack patterns are being used in a very short period of time. And very often it would be, for example, in the aftermath of a sensitive reporting of an election period or something where they could clearly see there would be motivation for such. And you could see, for example, how you would have things more connected, I would say, with information suppression techniques. So, harassment of staff, suspicious phone calls, emails with, violence threats, connected, for example, to try to silence or disrupt or somehow kind of tamper with the work that these organizations were doing. And at the same time, they would have, attempts of phishing or of taking control of their domain or other kind of more cybersecurity risks. So of course, attribution here, and I see there's another question on attribution, is always something very challenging, and we may not sometimes know for sure. But if one thing that this project brings is, instead of looking at the coordination on an organizational level, which is EUDL saying, I think this is coordinated because 5 things are happening to us at the same time, is you get a full picture of actually there is 20 for example, organizations in the disinformation community that are all being targeted with these 5 attack patterns at the same time. And there you have a good evidence base to feel that it is coordinated.
Thank you. Yeah, and I invite you to check our CIB Coordinated Inauthentic Behavior Detection 3 on our website that we shared last year at EU DisinfoLab. The question on attribution, you already replied to
Just
mostly.
if I can just
Yeah.
add very briefly, at the CyberPeace Institute, we don't actually conduct our own attribution analysis, but we do corroborate the attribution efforts done by other organizations when it comes to publishing, for example, on publicly identified cyber incidents. However, we do have our ransomware report that was published, I want to say a few months ago, where we go into detail when it comes to the infrastructure being used for ransomware and whether or not we could possibly have that, is it attributed to certain countries such as the Russian Federation or China? And interestingly enough, you can see that some of the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, servers or IP addresses actually can be shared amongst different groups, but also amongst different countries. So if you'd like to, you can read through that report as well.
Adding to what Tanner was saying, the recent report, the last 3 EAS report also mentioned an identified network that was used both in overload and camouflage. And this is connected again to the other H-Armor project we mentioned, which looks at how these, basically influence for hire or, cyber attacks as a service kind of industries are basically providing this digital services to any threat actor. So it's normal that you start seeing an overlap.
Thank you. Another great question on the screen. Looking ahead, what would it take for EDRN to become a genuinely sustainable community-owned infrastructure rather than a project-funded initiative? And what are the key conditions for that transition?
So there is two levels here. One is the development of the kind of back end of the entire dashboard and platform that involves a lot of technical work, and that would be very hard to be developed based solely on CSO support or becoming kind of a community-based concept. After developing, there is several pathways. So after the dashboard is developed and we only need maintenance and updates, then there's several ways. So the CyberPeace Builders, as Tanner has mentioned, has a lot of support from private volunteers. You have other options, which is the community itself, as it says there, kind of owning the infrastructure and the advantages this would mean, with things like even with social monitoring tools, instead of having, each one having their own license, having like a shared license, for example, comparing results. You can see how all of this can become very useful and actually economically appealing to CSOs. So there is a lot of pathways after the infrastructure has been built to maintain it and to keep it. This is not the main concern. Our main kind of challenge right now is really securing the way to technically developing the backbone of it.
Thank you. We can finish with the 2 last questions on the screen. The pilot data shows that 80% of CSOs lacks of a formal incident response plan. But is the problem really the absence of plan, or is it something deeper like capacity, trust, sense that incidents are too normalized to document?
I would say that it is just an example. I'd say yes, of course, it might be a bit deeper, but looking into it, why, the lack of our incident response plan is essentially just one element that is lacking. It really has to look into, for example, the resources of these organizations. For example, with the CyberPeace Builders program, with these NGOs, nonprofits, these civil society organizations, a lot of them, for the most part, they don't either have anyone working in those in their organizations that are dedicated to cybersecurity, due to lack of resources. For example, for the most part of them, most of them, the money that they receive, the funding that they receive, is being used 100% when it comes to their actual actions or criteria. For example, it could be humanitarian work, it could be, medical, or it could be democracy resilience, as we're talking about today. For the most part of these organizations, the money that they're getting is all being spent when it comes to furthering their goals in their sector. And so they don't have the excess funding that they can have to dedicate when it comes to cybersecurity. So they don't have that staff, either one person on their team to actually do that, or it's something that's very ad hoc. Someone might do it at one point and then it changes to another person. And so that's what the at least the CyberPeace Builders program, that we can at least help these organizations who don't have either the know-how or the budget. And so yes, I think it's the incidents, maybe just the lack of incident response plans, maybe just one example, but of something that's a bit more deeper.
Great, thank you. And the last question before we wrap up, what is your level of coordination with public institutions in Europe? I work in strategic communication with a Romanian public institution and would be interested in exploring collaboration. I would reply to the person to send us an email to edrn.disinfo.eu. Yeah, we can discuss this further, I guess, after. Thank you very much to both of you for this great presentation, and also on a personal note, for the great collaboration we have on this project. This is the kind of grounded, practical knowledge sharing pilot projects that makes a real difference for our community. So I think it's a really good project. And thank you all as well for attending today and for the questions just now. A few reminders before we close. The recording of this webinar will be available shortly on our YouTube channel, where you can also revisit our past sessions. And you see on the screen now the upcoming webinars with the schedules. The next one is on the 9th of April next week on civil society evidence under the DSA, lessons from AI forensics. Then you have one on the 23rd of April, decoding Russian intelligence, what methods and insignia reveal. And one in May and June, and you can find this on our website as well. And we hope to see you again very soon, either online, in person, or at our annual conference in Vilnius this October. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.